In the cradle of East Asia, a wondrous cultural mosaic is formed as myths and historical truths intertwine. From the divine descent of Korea's Tangun, the mythical progenitor born of heavenly beings, to Japan's Amaterasu lineage that still resonates in its imperial history. These origin stories embody the spiritual and political foundations of the region. China's early chronicles offer a more humanistic lens, with legends of Fuxi and Shennong, who domesticated animals and invented farming, carving a distinct path toward civilization. While echoing divine themes, these tales gradually gave way to a rich tapestry of historical progress. Yet, East Asia's civilization did not emerge in isolation. Modern archaeology and genetic discoveries trace human migration and cultural exchange threads, revealing a complex interplay of indigenous innovation and external influences. In the shadow of the Yellow River, northern China cultivated millet and built painted pottery traditions, while the southern Yangtze Basin perfected rice agriculture amidst lush landscapes. Meanwhile, Korea and Japan developed unique yet intertwined identities shaped by maritime connections and continental interactions. The shared linguistic and literary traditions across East Asia, particularly the Chinese script, played a significant role in solidifying its cultural cohesion. The Chinese script, a symbol of intellectual prestige, transcended national boundaries, providing a unified medium for philosophy, governance, and art. It became a cornerstone for disseminating Confucian ideals, which valued moral governance, filial piety, and self-cultivation. While Taoism and legalism offered alternative paths, seeking harmony with nature or advocating pragmatic rule, Confucianism's principles resonated across Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, influencing their cultural and political landscapes for centuries. East Asia's early history is a testament to resilience and adaptation. Through waves of conquest, migration, and cultural synthesis, it forged a distinct identity that continues to inspire the modern world. As we delve into its storied past, we uncover not just the roots of a region, but the shared aspirations of humanity, a connection that transcends time and space, striving for harmony, wisdom, and connection. East Asian Civilization's Beginnings. The deity Huaneng descended from heaven to Mount Taibek, a sacred peak at the source of the Yalu and Tumen rivers on the border between modern-day Korea and China, where he mated with a shear he had assisted in transforming into human shape, according to a now-lost old record referenced in the Korean history book Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, Samguk Yusa, written in the 13th century. According to legend, the powerful Lord Tangun, now widely regarded as the founding father of the Korean nation, was born from their union in 2333 BCE. In the meantime, the grandson of the sun goddess Amaterasu was sent down to earth from heaven with the three sacred Japanese imperial regalia, the sword, the bronze mirror, and the curved Magatama bead, to become the founder of the Japanese imperial line, the same line that still holds the chrysanthemum throne in Tokyo today, and the ancestor of the Japanese nation, according to a very different record of ancient matters, the Japanese Kojiki, compiled in 712 CE. Although Western scholars have generally been more impressed by the relative absence of significant creation myths from the beginning of Chinese history, various ancient royal houses in China also typically claimed divine or miraculous origins much earlier. The traditional version of China's history instead starts with a seemingly human era of legendary cultural heroes, including the Yellow Emperor, who ruled from 2697 BCE and is generally considered the ancestor of the Chinese people, Shennong, who invented farming in 2737 BCE, and Fuxi, who is thought to have first domesticated animals in 2852 BCE. Some of these myths and legends are still very endearing, even though the Japanese emperor formally renounced his divinity in 1946 following World War II. And few people today are likely to take the story of Japanese imperial descent from the sun goddess literally. 1. However, it is unlikely that many non-native people from various religious and cultural traditions took these tales of divine descent very seriously. Early modern Europeans, for instance, had distinct assumptions about possible East Asian ancestry. In a 1667 Amsterdam book, Athanasius Kircher hypothesized that the Chinese came from Noah's biblical son Ham via Egypt, explaining the apparent parallels between Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese writing. Even after Europeans gained a deeper understanding of East Asia, they long accepted that civilization must have spread to China and everywhere else, from a common universal point of origin in the Middle East. Even though the West began its history in the Fertile Crescent, now Egypt and Iraq, the assumption remains that all civilizations originated in the West. The notion that all native non-Western peoples could not achieve civilization on their own understandably offended many non-Westerners. Many academics started to favor an opposing theory of nearly entirely independent indigenous origin as new archaeological evidence gradually accumulated over the 20th century, demonstrating that China's Bronze Age civilization was extremely ancient and showed little evidence of direct importation from the West. For instance, Ping Ti Ho's seminal 1975 study dubbed China the Cradle of the East, drawing a comparison to the Fertile Crescent's so-called Cradle of Western Civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Assuming that there was only a choice between diffusion from a single common source and completely independent local development was always a mistake. Actually, these options are separate from one another. Though it's also true that movement was usually slow and challenging in antiquity, and local communities, especially those relatively remote and isolated, naturally developed independently, people have always traveled and communicated over great distances. Often referred to as not so much diffusion as dialectic, the most plausible explanation for the world's various historical civilizations is a combination of shared ultimate human origins and numerous ongoing local diversification and exchange processes. The likelihood that all contemporary humans worldwide have relatively recent common ancestors and are closely related is growing due to new genetic discoveries, particularly the study of mitochondrial DNA. According to a widely accepted theory, modern humans only moved across the globe in the last 100,000 years from a common ancestral homeland in Africa. Modern humans arrived in eastern Eurasia by at least 25,000 BCE, possibly as early as 50,000, 60,000 years ago, according to carbon-14 dating. Prominent scientists who reject the out-of-Africa theory concur that it is improbable that distinct human groups originated in entirely different regions. Rather, they believe that all differences in humans developed within a loose network of genetic exchanges over a much longer period to preserve the species' overall genetic similarity. In light of this, there were three major centers of Late Stone Age, Neolithic cultural development worldwide. One centered on maize, corn in the Americas, one centered on rice and millet in eastern Eurasia, and one centered on wheat and barley in western Eurasia. There were several regional Late Stone Age cultures in eastern Eurasia as well. Moreover, these cultures did not always coincide with the boundaries of contemporary nations. For instance, assuming that these Stone Age peoples were already Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, or Japanese is deceptively anachronistic. There was a significant divide between the North and South, and even within the area we now consider China proper, there was a tremendous deal of local variation. By at least 8,000 BCE, the southern peoples were growing rice in the lower Yangtze River Valley, making pottery with impressed geometric designs, loving boats, and most likely speaking languages more closely related to those spoken in Southeast Asia than to modern Chinese. They also tended to raise their houses on posts above ground level. Meanwhile, the northern peoples, especially those in the Central Plain and the Yellow River Valley, grew millet and often lived in partially underground homes, perhaps for insulation. At least some of these northern peoples must have spoken an early dialect of Chinese. According to contemporary archaeologists, Yangshao is the most well-known northern cultural complex, dating back to approximately 5000 BCE, and it is renowned for its vibrantly decorated, painted pottery. Beginning around 1500 BCE, the climate along the northernmost fringe, roughly in what is now Inner Mongolia, became colder and drier, and the local population gradually shifted from agriculture to livestock rearing. Animals such as sheep and cattle, capable of grazing and self-feeding on wild grass, started outcompete pigs, historically the primary source of meat in the Chinese diet. By 500 BCE, these northern peoples might have transitioned into true pastoral nomads, as the art of horseback riding, believed to have originated in the western steppe, a vast grassland stretching from the Hungarian plain in Europe to Mongolia, finally reached the region surrounding China. For most of pre-modern history, the Chinese considered these nomads who raised livestock their main cultural rivals and regular military foes. While many of these nomads lived inside the boundaries of modern-day China, others lived in Inner Mongolia and occasionally even further south in China itself. Dynamically, the nomads interacted with the agriculturally oriented Chinese civilization, creating a system that pitted the two poles against each other. Numerous families that ruled over Chinese imperial dynasties were either semi-nomadic or nomadic. Despite their stark differences, the farmers of northern China and the pastoral nomads of Inner Mongolia share a common history. On the other hand, the Korean peninsula was home to several prehistoric cultures, some of which overlapped with Manchuria in modern-day China. There are intriguing indications of ties to the Japanese islands by the end of Korean prehistory. Diverse components contributed to the remarkable homogeneity of Korean national identity today. Moreover, it took a comparatively long time for the current Korean cultural uniformity to come together. The specifics of Korean history emerged only when Chinese documents from the early imperial era mentioned the Korean peninsula. However, the knowledge that rice cultivation began there by at least 1000 BCE and bronze metalworking might have emerged a few centuries later. Before those initial documentary mentions, people from the Korean peninsula had most likely started moving south across the straits into the Japanese islands. Ancient maritime ties between Japan and Southeast Asia and a land bridge linking Japan to the Asian mainland may have existed earlier. Without a doubt, people have lived on the Japanese islands since very early times. However, the population of Japan in the late Stone Age was always small, likely never reaching more than 250,000 people across the islands, and extensive farming and metalworking only appeared in the Japanese islands about 300 BCE. After that, new arrivals from the Korean peninsula led to a sudden surge of major new developments. Japan is notable for producing some of the earliest known pottery on Earth, dating back to around 11,000 BCE. A 3rd century CE Chinese text contains the first written account of Japan, similar to that of Korea. It is also true that mobility was typically restricted in antiquity, particularly for agricultural peoples confined to farmland, even though all modern humans share common ancestors. Moreover, more interaction and communication among diverse population groups has been consistently greater than commonly perceived. There was a significant amount of autonomous local cultural development in every location. East Asia developed into a distinct cultural region within the Eurasian Old World. One particularly obvious sign of East Asian uniqueness was the use of a writing system, a script, throughout the region in pre-modern times, which was remarkably different from the phonetic spelling systems and alphabets derived from the Middle East, eventually used everywhere else. East Asian writing systems and languages. Nicholas Ostler states, "Language communities are the real players in world history, far more so than princes, states, or economies. As we have seen, the same Old English word that denoted people or nation may also denote language." Languages comprise an essential part of the narrative of East Asian civilization and are often central to the self-identification of human communities and a major obstacle to communication with others. In fact, the language might be the most unique feature of China. Even though East Asian languages are, by definition, foreign to native English speakers, it is important to have a basic understanding of them from the beginning. Otherwise, any discussion of language runs the risk of becoming extremely technical. I'll make an effort to keep it easy. Different national traditions divide the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese languages. 4 major national language systems divide East Asia into at least 3 distinct language families. Furthermore, these language families are not exclusive to East Asia. In pre-modern times, the shared use of a common writing system, and surprisingly, even a common written language, gave East Asia much of its cultural cohesion and uniqueness as a region, not the spoken languages. The languages of China and Japan, for instance, are very different. Japanese is polysyllabic, where simple basic syllables stack agglutinatively to create complex grammatical distinctions, such as the distinction between doing something now and doing it in the past. The most notable aspect of Japanese is that it is a respectful language, keigo, which means that honorific particles and word endings convey the relative status of the speaker and listener and the level of formality or informality. For instance, "I am studying" can be expressed formally with Benkyo shite imasu, but more casually with Benkyo shite iru. Grammatical particles are another tool we use to distinguish between the different parts of a sentence. Japanese sentences typically follow the subject wa, object o verb pattern. For example, "I wa book o read," with the verb always appearing at the end. Chinese is nearly the opposite. The verb comes before the object in this more English-like word order. "I read a book," for example. The Chinese language is entirely uninflected, lacking tenses, plurals, or grammatical changes to word endings. Chinese is not regarded as a respected language, at least not in the Japanese sense, as its grammar necessitates the consideration of status relationships, even in situations where polite communication is possible. A single syllable pronounces each Chinese character, a written symbol with a unique meaning. Modern Chinese typically uses 2 or 3 character combinations to create the equivalent of longer compound words. For instance, 3 characters write the well-known Chinese place name Tiananmen. Tian, heaven; A, peace; and men, gate, symbolizing the gate of heavenly peace. Tiananmen Square adds 2 more characters, guang, which means broad or spacious, and change, which means an area of level ground. Although conceptually we may think of Tiananmen as a single word, and Tiananmen Square as 2, each written Chinese character always takes up approximately equal square or rectangular space on the page. Chinese writers traditionally wrote in vertical columns, from top to bottom. Although it has gained popularity since the late 19th century, the Western orientation of horizontal writing from left to right remains uncommon today. Spoken Chinese, unlike English and Japanese, is a tonal language. The tone or pitch of a syllable determines a word's meaning in speech, but not in writing. The standard dialect of modern Mandarin has 4 tones, plus 1 neutral tone, and some dialects have more. There are several regional dialects of Chinese. Moreover, certain dialects are incomprehensible to one another. At times, their differences can rival those of German and English, commonly recognized as distinct languages rather than dialects of the same Germanic tongue. Because of this, Some experts reject the term dialects entirely, arguing that it is misleading for the regional dialects of Chinese speech. Instead, they favor more neutral terms like regionals or topolecs, derived from the Greek word topos, which means place. Today, a sizable majority, about 69% of people on the island of Taiwan, speak a dialect as their mother tongue, also known as a topolect. Originally from Fujian province on the mainland, just across the straits, this dialect, technically called Southern Min, is now more commonly known as Taiwanese. This Taiwanese dialect is incomprehensible to Mandarin speakers, whom Taiwan has formally promoted as the national language, Guoyu, since 1945. An additional 15% of Taiwan's population may be native speakers of Hakka, yet another radically different dialect. Moreover, many individuals on the island continue to speak Aboriginal languages that are entirely non-Chinese in nature. Other parts of the Chinese mainland also speak Taiwanese and Hakka, languages that originated in the straits of Fujian province. While Fujian province hosts some of China's most extreme dialectical varieties, Chinese expatriates dispersed throughout Southeast Asia also widely speak Fujian dialects. The southeast coastal region typically concentrates on major variant Chinese dialects. China's language situation is more complicated than it is. The most striking aspect of the Chinese spoken language is its surprising uniformity, even with the sometimes confusing diversity of local dialects, also known as topolecs. Nowhere else in the pre-modern world has ever been a linguistic unity like that of North China. 9. Approximately 3/4 of all Chinese, especially in the north and west, are native speakers of a relatively uniform form of Mandarin called Guoyu in Chinese and Putonghua in English. With about 300 million speakers, the Mandarin dialect of Chinese is actually the most widely spoken native language in the world today. The linguistic map of Europe is still very diverse in contrast to this Chinese homogeneity. In a broader sense, some contend that all of the regional dialects of Chinese are part of a broader Sino-Tibetan language family, which distantly connects Chinese to Tibetan, Burmese, and other languages not found in East Asia. The two East Asian languages that diverge the most from the Sino-Tibetan language family are Japanese and Korean. People in the north and west occasionally regard them as belonging to a distinct, more speculative Altaic or Ural-Altaic language family. This family includes Manchu, Mongolic, Turkic, and possibly Finnish people. There is no doubt that Japanese is more similar to Korean than to any other language currently in use. The two may diverge from a single ancestral tongue, but if that's the case, they were already different by the beginning of history. So it's unnecessary to overstate how similar they are now. Conversely, there are still distinct regional dialects in Japanese. For instance, the Standard Japanese, which is based on the dialect of Tokyo in the east, is still distinct from the Osaka Ben, or Osaka dialect, which is occasionally heard on the streets of Japan's second-largest city in the west of the main island. Even within Korea, a 3rd-century Chinese description stated that the people in the southeast of the Korean peninsula spoke a different language than those in the southwest, despite Korea being currently the most homogeneous of all contemporary East Asian countries. If Chinese is a Sino-Tibetan language and Korean and Japanese are Altaic, the Vietnamese language falls under the Austroasiatic category. Originally, speakers of languages similar to those in Southeast Asia and beyond resided in Vietnam, a significant area of today's Southeast China. The spread of Chinese must have gradually displaced these languages from Southeast China, leaving behind only a substratum of vocabulary items and contributing to the dialectical complexity of the region. For example, the standard Northern Chinese word for river, he, as in the Huanghe, or Yellow River, contrasts with the commonly used word for river in South China, jiang, as in the Yangtze Jiang, or Yangtze River. Therefore, we divide East Asia into three drastically different major language families, four contemporary national languages, numerous regional dialects, and some entirely distinct languages spoken by ethnic minorities. However, the widespread use of the Chinese writing system was a linguistic characteristic that all of pre-modern East Asia had in common and acted as a strong unifying force. Around 3400 BCE, Mesopotamia was the first place where written symbols represented spoken words. Shortly after that, Egypt, located nearby, independently reimagined the concept. Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia remained remarkably distinct despite their close proximity. Only much later, around 1200 BCE, during the siege of Troy, which Homer immortalized, did writing begin to appear in China. However, despite its relatively late creation, the Chinese script represents another independent invention. Technically, we can classify the world's earliest writing systems, such as Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese and Mayan, as logographic. This means that they were not primarily phonetic systems, but rather represented the meanings of words as much as their sounds. Chinese characters, or Hanzi, as they are known in China, may have started out as extremely abstract and simplified images of the objects they represented. However, they quickly recognized the limitations of a pictographic writing system, and the vast majority of Chinese characters soon developed both a component that suggested approximate meaning, e.g., having to do with a hand, mouth, water, fire, fish, etc., and another component that vaguely indicated pronunciation. Standard desktop dictionaries typically only list about 7,000 characters, but the most comprehensive Chinese dictionaries available today list nearly 50,000. Even these shorter dictionaries only use a few thousand characters, so mastering just a few thousand can lead to functional literacy. In 1946, the Japanese government released the Toyo Kanji list, an official list of 1,850 approved characters meant to be adequate for all purposes. Memorizing even the smallest possible list of Chinese characters is difficult compared to the smaller number of symbols used in an alphabet. However, the unquestionable difficulty of learning the system has not stopped people who use the Chinese script from reaching comparatively high literacy rates in both pre-modern and modern times, nor has it presented an insurmountable barrier to creating some of the best literature in the world. It is also possible to argue that the system has some built-in advantages. People often assume that early logographic writing systems like Chinese, cuneiform, or hieroglyphics are an early phase of a universal linear progression toward the development of an alphabet. The fact that none of these early logographic scripts developed straight into a purely phonetic writing system presents a serious flaw in this assumption. The development of phonetic writing systems in the Middle East and East Asia occurred only after other peoples modified the logographic scripts already used to write languages other than their native tongues. 12. According to the classic example, scribes in Canaan or Byblos, located along the Mediterranean Sea's eastern shore, created the alphabet before 1500 BCE. They were familiar with Egyptian and possibly cuneiform, and they wanted to create a system that would be more appropriate than Egyptian for writing their own language. This original Canaanite alphabet gave rise to the more well-known Phoenician alphabet, the Greek, Roman, Arabic, Indian, and most other phonetic scripts still in use today by 1000 BCE. 13. Eventually, the logographic Chinese inspired both the Japanese and the Koreans in East Asia to develop their own phonetic writing systems and create new scripts to write their drastically different languages. French missionaries and later colonial authorities first exposed Vietnam to the Roman alphabet straight from Europe. The majority of the world's other original ancient logographic writing systems, including Mayan, hieroglyphics, and cuneiform, have since disappeared from use, as have the languages that went with them. For example, despite its tenuous survival in the form of Coptic, Arabic has long since supplanted the ancient Egyptian language as Egypt's national language. Nonetheless, Chinese is still the most widely spoken native language in the world today. The Chinese have had little need to give up their original writing system because it works well for their language. Regional variations of written characters began appearing in China before the first imperial unification in 221 BCE. Later, imperial unification standardized the writing system, and the civil service examination system significantly stabilized and solidified the educational curriculum, particularly at the elite level, defining late imperial China. In Chinese characters, the written word gained immense prestige. The industrialized modern West severely challenged China's position as the dominant regional power early in the 20th century, causing a deep cultural crisis and making many Western models seem unavoidable. The communist leader Mao Zedong was among the many would-be modernizers who frequently concluded that modernization would inevitably include the alphabetization of Chinese writing. The People's Republic officially approved a standardized Chinese spelling system using our Roman alphabet, Pinyin, for educational and other limited applications. Still, the simplification, which reduced the number of strokes needed to write them to over 2,000 characters in the 1950s and 1960s, was the only noteworthy accomplishment. In hindsight, it's possible that even simplification didn't make the system much simpler because it required highly educated people to learn both the new and traditional forms, which are still used in Taiwan and Hong Kong by many Chinese living abroad, and, of course, in old books. Furthermore, in the more recent era of computer-generated word processing, reducing the number of pen strokes has gained some relevance, but it only improves writing, not reading. In China, the logographic writing system is still in use in the 21st century and appears less dangerous than 50 years ago. Their persistent adherence to the Chinese writing system, rather than their eventual departure, may be more remarkable given the stark differences between Chinese and the other East Asian languages. For instance, one contemporary scholar jokes, "It would have been far easier to write English, which is structurally similar to Chinese, with Chinese characters, than to adapt this system to Japanese, although no one would wish for it." The early Japanese had three main choices when modifying the Chinese writing system to write Japanese. 1. They could use a Chinese character only for its meaning, disregarding its pronunciation and using it to represent a roughly equivalent pre-existing word in spoken Japanese, or 2. They could import a new Chinese loanword into Japanese by borrowing the Chinese character's meaning and pronunciation. Representing Japanese grammatical distinctions absent in Chinese remained a challenge in both cases. A third option was to carefully spell out the sounds of native Japanese words using Chinese characters, ignoring their meaning and only using them for pronunciation. Finally, the Japanese could learn the foreign Chinese language directly for reading and writing purposes. The Japanese have been practicing these skills since the introduction of writing in their country in the 5th century. Although a large portion of early Japanese writing was in Chinese, the Kojiki, record of ancient matters, Japan's oldest surviving history, was written in Japanese using Chinese characters in 712. However, early attempts to transcribe the Japanese language this way resulted in incredibly difficult reading. The fact that almost all characters still in use today have at least two distinct pronunciations, one reflecting the borrowed approximation of the Chinese sound, and the other representing a roughly equivalent, but initially unrelated native Japanese word, is one long-lasting effect of the various approaches taken to using Chinese characters in Japan. For instance, the Chinese character Dao, which means way, as in Taoism, or road, can be pronounced in Japanese either natively as michi, which is a common word for road, or approximately Chinese style as do, as in the martial art judo, the way of suppleness, or tu, as in the Japanese religion Shinto, the way of the spirits. The Chinese characters used to phonetically spell out Japanese underwent a process of standardization, simplification, and reduction in number during the 9th or 10th century. Ultimately, they produced two sets of about 51 symbols each, the curved and feminine hiragana, and the angular and masculine katakana, known as kana. The Japanese could write all their syllable sounds fluently with these kana symbols. These kana, derived from Chinese characters, have lost their original meaning and appearance. We could write the Japanese language using a native Japanese phonetic script. Japanese writers quickly employed these kana to create some of history's most notable early literary works. The Tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, penned by Lady Murasaki Shikibu at the start of the 11th century, 978-1016, is arguably the most well-known. Many regard The Tale of Genji as the first outstanding true novel or lengthy prose fiction in history. It tells the story of Prince Genji's love affairs at the Japanese imperial court. The piece captures the unique Japanese sentiment of the time, mono no aware, the depressing nature of things. Buddhism influences the awareness of the impermanence and transience of all existence. Throughout this book, the word sadness actually occurs 1,018 times. In practice, men frequently crossed the gender boundary between supposedly masculine Chinese characters and feminine hiragana, writing phonetically in kane, while some notable Japanese ladies were undoubtedly literate in Chinese. This was true even though the phonetic Japanese hiragana script was, at the time, frequently disparagingly referred to as woman's hand. However, it did contribute to the creation of several early works of striking genius and universal appeal, such as The Tale of Genji. However, for a long time, the most esteemed medium for serious writing in Japan was still the Chinese script, and even the Chinese language itself. One notable aristocrat from the 12th century, Fujiwara Michinori, 1106-1159, had no Japanese scripted books in his library. The intellectual superiority of Chinese writing in Japan would face a deadly challenge in the modern era. Although the shogun's library was last catalogued in 1864-1866, 65% of the materials were still Chinese or Chinese style. When Japan and China went to war in 1894, they still wrote the bulk of Japanese war poetry in classical Chinese, a conflict that would first dramatically demonstrate Japan's success in becoming a modern Western-style power, and China's failure to do the same. Only at that unexpectedly late date did the movement to write in a standardized vernacular Japanese national language, Kokugo, start. Today, all of the Japanese islands use the Japanese language for writing. With the addition of hiragana for grammatical issues and some common basic words, Japan continues to use Chinese characters for word roots. Meanwhile, katakana serves as the primary language for Western loanwords, which are now abundant. A 1970s study revealed that Western loanwords, particularly those from English, constituted up to 10% of everyday Japanese vocabulary. However, these English words often undergo domestication beyond simple recognition during their assimilation into Japanese. Some of the most frequently used English loanwords include kara, color, naiyusu, news, teribi, television, biru, beer, and suppotsu, sports. Korea is geographically closer to China than Japan, and in pre-modern times, Chinese influence was typically proportionately greater. However, Koreans had already begun experimenting with using Chinese characters to partially phonetically write the native Korean language in a form called Idu, possibly as early as the 5th century. Despite this slight advancement, Only roughly 50 poems written in vernacular Korean from the pre-15th century period survive today, in contrast to thousands of Korean documents written in Chinese. 18. In 1281, Irian, 1206-1289, a proudly patriotic Korean priest historian, wrote his priceless early history of Korea, Samguk Yusa, Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, primarily in Chinese, but with some poetry in his native tongue. Hangul, a distinctive new 28-letter Korean alphabet, is credited to the great Korean king Sejong in 1446. The Korean Hangul is a true alphabet, representing the smallest possible sound units, as opposed to the Japanese kana, which represents the sounds of entire syllables. Hangul can write anything in Korean without using Chinese characters. The educated Korean elite regarded Chinese language writing as more prestigious even after establishing a sizable and expanding Korean language literature. Only in the 20th century did Korea largely abandon Chinese characters. Since then, Korea has done a better job than Japan at rejecting Chinese characters. Until the late 19th century, when Vietnamese writing adopted the Roman alphabet during French colonial rule, Vietnamese people continued to use Chinese characters and the classical Chinese language. Consequently, East Asia continued to widely utilize the Chinese writing system, and to a lesser but still significant extent, the traditional Chinese written language just recently. This seemingly unwieldy Chinese logographic script's remarkable longevity is largely due to its cultural prestige and the weight of tradition. Another factor was the relative lack of significant regional competition for the Chinese writing system until the 19th century. The system does, however, have certain built-in advantages. Even though an alphabet is simpler to learn and more adaptable in its application to various languages, it also phonetically reproduces the cacophony of sound in writing. However, learning Chinese characters is difficult, and they only offer a universal ideographic way to express ideas with a language translation. However, once mastered, they express the same meaning across all languages and dialects at any time. This universality should be balanced. For instance, the character shu, which originally meant either to write or something that is written in classical Chinese, has almost always come to mean specifically book in modern Chinese, while in Japan it is typically used for the verb, pronounced kaku, to write. Even native Chinese Mandarin speakers no longer use exactly the same script due to late 20th century script simplification in the People's Republic of China, but not in Taiwan or other parts of the greater Chinese world. Despite these limitations, the Chinese script can be beautiful and powerful for anyone who has learned the system. In contrast to their Bronze Age vocabulary, Chinese characters are incredibly adaptable to new ideas. For instance, a computer is electricity plus brain, Diano. Democracy is people plus master, Minju. And a stock exchange is proof plus certificate plus meet plus exchange plus place, Zhengquan Jiaoyisuo. Another contemporary, or at least 19th century European concept that has little precedent in traditional East Asia is communism, which is rendered as collective plus production plus ism. Gongchanzhu, where ism is master plus meaning. Although printing originated in East Asia with its wide variety of characters, the Chinese script might have been more suited for portable printing, making it impossible to develop a convenient Chinese typewriter. However, in the post-typewriter era of digital computers, the Chinese script now poses significantly fewer drawbacks. In fact, experts predict that Chinese will surpass English as the world's most widely used computer language, given China's already substantial online population. While China undertook extensive language reforms, abandoning the classical written language in favor of a modern vernacular in the early 20th century and simplifying the script in the People's Republic more recently, Korea and Vietnam largely abandoned Chinese characters in the 20th century due to modern Western influences. At the same time, Japan thoroughly domesticated them, and they seem to be an integral part of traditional Japanese culture, usually used with native phonetic kana. Nevertheless, the ghost of this once shared pre-modern written language continues to loom over East Asia, with more than 1/3 of the vocabulary items in modern Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese languages derived from Chinese. Considering the large number of modern English words that ultimately come from Greek or Latin, this should be less surprising and less offensive to nationalist sensibilities. The prestige Latin enjoyed in Western Europe for a long time is comparable to that of classical Chinese in East Asia. Until 1500, about 75% of all books published in Western Europe were still in Latin. Just as Western civilization shares a core group of Greco-Roman heritage, East Asian civilization also shares a legacy of writing in classical Chinese and reading a core group of common books written in that language. In contrast, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Western Europe, the United States, and most other societies we are familiar with today are secondary states or civilizations, meaning that they emerged chronologically somewhat later, under the influence of older neighbors or predecessors. One of the world's major early primary civilizations was located in northern China, specifically in the Central Plain region of the lower Yellow River. It is not entirely clear why the Central Plain area should have favored this breakthrough, given that the major primary civilizations of the world developed in sometimes significantly different ecological environments. The Mayans, for example, amid the tropical forests of Central America, the Egyptians in the arid river valley of the Nile, and the Chinese in the temperate rain-watered Central Plain of North China. For instance, no evidence supports theories that the organized mass mobilization of labor for irrigation led to the rise of early civilizations in China during the Bronze Age. The Central Plain is, however, a large and relatively level area suitable for dry field agriculture. Millet and later wheat were the principal crops of the Central Plain. Wet field rice cultivation, although equally ancient, was mostly limited to the originally semi-foreign south, centering on a major river. The Central Plain is also relatively accessible overland from Western Eurasia, which may, or may not, have been a contributing factor. In contrast to Mesopotamia, where civilization emerged as early as 3500 BCE, and Egypt, which unified circa 3100 BCE, China's Bronze Age civilization emerged relatively late, around 2000 BCE. However, China's civilization was indisputably ancient by almost any other measure. As we've seen, traditional Chinese histories start with an era of renowned cultural heroes such as Fuxi, Shennong, the Yellow Emperor, and a string of later sage rulers culminating in Great Yu, who ruled from 2205 BCE. According to the traditional story, Great Yu tamed a catastrophic flood and established the first dynasty, Xia, which later became the first of the so-called three dynasties. Xia, traditionally dated 2205-1766 BCE, Shang, Kai 1766, 1045 BCE, and Zhou 1045-256 BCE, which make up the classical age of Chinese antiquity. The issue arises from the fact that China didn't adopt writing until approximately 1200 BCE, necessitating recording all the tales about these remarkable ancient cultural heroes only decades after the events they purport to depict. Traditional Chinese scholars highly respected and generally accepted the legends of high antiquity without question. However, the fall of the Chinese Empire in 1912 and the widespread modernization of the early 20th century led to calls for a more scientific history, sparking a movement to question antiquity in the 1920s. At that time, people viewed everything as traditional with some skepticism. All of the stories that claim to deal with events before the Zhou dynasty were legends in the literal sense of the Chinese word for the legend. Chuan shuo, passed on sayings. One could easily regard oral traditions as legendary in a mythical and possibly false sense. The inscriptions on some of the oracle bones, the remains of an ancient Shang dynasty capital, contain the earliest known examples of Chinese language writing. However, in 1899, Chinese scholars noticed some particularly archaic-looking Chinese writing on old turtle shells and bones, marketed for medicine as dragon bones. Researchers eventually traced these bones to a source near the modern city of Anyang in the northern province of Henan. In 1928, scientifically trained archaeologists finally started excavating the site, uncovering the ruins of an ancient Shang dynasty capital. The oracle bone inscriptions and the dramatic archaeological rediscovery of the last Shang capital provided unquestionable new documentary evidence, as they spectacularly verified much of the later part of the traditional Chinese story. The earliest parts of the traditional narrative are, at best, unverified and have a distinct mythical flavor. For example, the idea that the Yellow Emperor is somehow the ancestor of all Chinese people is not only scientifically dubious, but also racist. Modern archaeology has generally tended to support traditional Chinese accounts, and there is much less of a skeptical inclination to doubt antiquity today than in the early 20th century. The current academic fashion emphasizes that Chinese civilization had multiple origins, in contrast to the earlier assumption that it must have spread from a single point of origin in the north. Beyond any doubt, there were numerous local prehistoric cultures scattered throughout the area of what we today call China during the late Stone Age, with a particularly broad division between the wet field rice-based cultivation of the southern Yangtze River Basin and the dry field millet-based agriculture of the northern Yellow River region. All these different cultures contributed to the brewing of Chinese civilization. Furthermore, a degree of regional diversity has remained a fixture throughout history, even today. However, the late Stone Age peoples of southern China appear to have spoken languages unrelated to Chinese, and it still does seem fair to say that the northern Central Plains Neolithic cultures, based on millet, sorghum, pig, dog, and silkworm raising, some of whom must have also spoken ancestral forms of the modern Chinese language, probably provided the core for what eventually became China. Sarah Allen recently proposed that the elite culture of Erlitou, named after an archaeological type site in modern Henan province, may have first set a standard for what became Chinese civilization. 22 radiocarbon dates Erlitou to approximately 2100 to 1600 BCE, making it the closest archaeological equivalent to what traditional sources call the Xia dynasty. The archaeologically identified Erlitou culture is the first to demonstrate the construction of royal palaces and the use of bronze for casting ritual vessels, ostensibly for making offerings to deceased ancestors. Such bronze ritual vessels subsequently spread through the entire region of China. Despite the massive production of these bronzes, they consistently adhered to a limited range of fixed standard shapes and shared common decorative themes like the abstract and somewhat mysterious Teoti design. Sarah Allen compares the spread of this elite bronze ritual culture to the dispersal of McDonald's fast food restaurants around the world today, extending everywhere from Chicago to Cairo, Tokyo, and Beijing, in that it did not necessarily imply either a single homogeneous ethnicity or centralized political control, but rather the widespread acceptance of the artifacts of a prestigious cultural model by independent local communities. Allen claims that the strikingly different collection of ancient bronzes found at Sanxingdui in Sichuan in southwest China in 1986 is all the more amazing because it is the only group of bronzes in all of China that seems to spring from an entirely different cultural style, and even though they are found mixed together with more standard Erlitou-derived types. The ritual behavior associated with these early two bronzes eventually became the standard of Chinese decorum, known as lai, a term that has been translated variously as courtesy, propriety, rites, or ceremony, and unfortunately lacks any precise English equivalent, at least until the revolutionary changes of the 20th century. It set an ideal standard for cultivated behavior in China and eventually throughout all East Asia, becoming a cornerstone for the cultural coherence of the region. For example, in 707 CE, one Japanese empress proclaimed that all the ways of government take the li, pronounced rai in Japanese as foremost. In contrast to the alternative model of small, independent city-states familiar from ancient Mesopotamia, people commonly understand the Shang dynasty, c. 1766–1045 BCE, as an early example of a relatively large, territorial state. The Shang ruler does appear to have been the only leader in the whole area of China at that time to claim the supreme sovereign title King, Wang. However, the Shang probably did not employ an extensively centralized bureaucratic government, but delegated authority to largely autonomous local leaders based in a far-flung network of walled towns. The Shang king may have frequently had direct or indirect relationships with these local leaders through marriage. For instance, Sarah Allen notes that oracle bone inscriptions record the names of 64 known wives of a specific late Shang king, with most of their names incorporating a place name component. She speculates that these probably signified royal marriage ties between the Shang king and those places, and suggests that the Shang may have been at the center of a vast network of marriage affiliations. Shang families were organized by seniority and patrilineal descent. The oldest member of the senior line headed the entire group. Married sons remained under their father's authority. Women joined their husbands' families after marriage. Notably, in the 19th century, the ancient character for the people, Min, and the ancient character for the descent group, Zhu, combined to create a new Chinese character translation for the Western word nation, Minzu. Shang queens, despite this blatant patriarchal male bias, have helped with administration, carried out ancestral rites, and sometimes organized armies. Evidence suggests that the increasing influence of Confucian moral ideals led to a decline in women's status in traditional China, peaking only in the early modern period. For instance, the Tang dynasty, 618–907 CE, may not have strongly influenced the ideal of the chaste widow, not marrying again after her husband dies, and the Qing, 1644–1912, may have been the last imperial dynasty to actively promote it. Female foot-binding did not begin until the Song, 960–1279 CE. The Shang kings exclusively sponsored oracle bone divination, a technique for asking questions of the spirits. It involved heating pieces of tortoise shells and other animal bones on the chest until they cracked, then interpreting the shape of the crack as a spirit's response. Eventually, people wrote the questions and sometimes the answers directly on the bones, creating the renowned oracle bone inscriptions, the oldest known examples of Chinese writing. Since ancient Egyptian pharaohs claimed a royal monopoly over religious offerings and Mayan kings occasionally used drug-induced trances to communicate with their ancestors and cosmic spirits, the Shang monarchy shared a theocratic dimension with many other ancient societies. However, it also differed to some extent from later Chinese history. The Shang Chinese were hardly the only early civilizations to view the king as a vital mediator between the human and spirit worlds. The Shang dynasty may have been more familiar to later Chinese standards than the Bronze Age civilization that reached its mature form in northern China under the Shang. Archaeologists rediscovered the Shang kings' practice of relatively large-scale human sacrifice and the existence of oracle bone inscriptions, strikingly confirming the Shang's historical existence in the 20th century. Around 1045 BCE, a foreign people known as the Zhou decisively conquered the Shang state and founded a new dynasty, and the Zhou dynasty marked the beginning of the vast formative age of classical Chinese civilization. China's Zhou dynasty, 1045 to 256 BCE. Originally distinct from the Shang, the Zhou overthrew the Shang dynasty circa 1045 BCE. Located west of the central Shang territory, the Zhou homeland, in present-day Shanxi, enjoyed political autonomy. But before their conquest, Zhou leaders recognized themselves as the Shang king's vassals. And Shang was the origin of much of Zhou high culture, including the creation and design of bronze vessels inscribed with a common written Chinese language, and oracle bone divination. A new synthesis or fusion was the result of their conquest. The newly formed Zhou dynasty absorbed the pre-existing Shang population following the conquest in 1045 BCE. The Zhou dynasty even allowed the former Shang royal family to maintain their identity by continuing their necessary ancestral sacrifices and taking on the title of dukes of Song, rather than sovereign kings. This demonstrates once more the degree to which Chinese civilization was a hybrid from the start, combining various regional cultural traditions. The large number of cowrie seashells imported from as far away as the Indian Ocean and the introduction of the horse-drawn chariot, which had first appeared centuries earlier in what is now Kazakhstan. From the northern steppe around 1250 BCE, possibly via the northeast, demonstrate that the late Shang had been a relatively small state existing within a field of roughly similar other cultures, and in contact with places that were much more remote. 1. Despite its largely indigenous development, Chinese civilization was never a closed, isolated system. From the ancient Scythians and Romans in the west to the Goguryeo in Korea, including the later Turks and Mongols, the origin myth of the Zhou is remarkably similar to that of a surprising number of other Eurasian peoples, as demonstrated by Christopher Beckwith. This suggests an unexpected degree of shared Eurasian culture. 2. According to the Zhou legend, the first ancestor of the Zhou people was conceived by a woman named Jiang Yuan, whose name literally means progenitress of the Jiang, referring to the Zhejiang, another early people who are sometimes regarded as ancestral to modern Tibetans and with whom the Zhou is said to have intermarried. When she stepped into the footprint of the supreme god Shangdi, also known as the Lord on High, Hu Ji, the Lord of Millet, is the son of Jiang Yuan's miraculous pregnancy. However, Jiang Yuan left her son in the country, thinking Shangdi disapproved of her pregnancy, only to have sheep and cattle lay down next to him to keep him warm, saving his life. She then tried to leave him in a forest, but woodcutters aided her. She left him once more on a patch of ice where birds used their wings to keep him warm. The Zhou people were the descendants of Hou Ji, who learned agricultural techniques as an adult, after being divinely conceived and receiving repeated supernatural protection as a child. According to the legend, these descendants lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle and even temporarily abandoned agriculture before relocating to the plain of Zhou, about 80 miles west of the present-day Chinese city of Xi'an. They are said to have derived their name from this plain. The plain of Zhou is situated in a much larger basin and is traditionally referred to as the area within the passes, Guanzhong. This sizable, fairly fertile agricultural region is surrounded by mountains, creating a massive natural stronghold used as a base for military conquest and Chinese unification throughout history. The prehistoric Zhou people, who lived on the northwest edge of the Bronze Age Chinese world and were clearly entangled in the interaction between farming and semi-nomadic livestock-raising lifestyles, were the product of cultural mixing from the beginning. As an early example of secondary state formation, the Zhou most likely developed from blending multiple local prehistoric cultures under the influence of the neighboring Shang civilization. Early Zhou bronze ritual vessels, for example, seemed to be modeled after Shang models, but as time passed, distinctive Zhou styles developed. The Zhou people were literally armed by Shang technologies. Their composite reflex bows and chariots were identical to Shang weapons, though it's possible that Zhou bronze armor was superior to Shang leather armor. The myth that the Zhou migrated there from somewhere else is supported by the fact that no discernible archaeological evidence of Zhou culture was discovered in the area within the passes until roughly a century before the Zhou conquest of the Shang. That somewhere else may have been a little further northeast, but its exact location remains unknown. The Zhou people might have mingled with other local populations when they first arrived, within the passes. The Shang king invested the Zhou chief as a vassal duke after they settled within the passes. The Zhou dukes were not satisfied with their inferior position, though, and quickly usurped the highest Shang title of sovereignty, rising to the position of kings. According to legend, the Shang killed the second Zhou king and imprisoned the third for 7 years before releasing him. The fourth Zhou king, King Wu, a posthumous title meaning the martial king, finally declared war on the Shang after generations of such repeated provocation. He accused the last Shang king of many wrongdoings, including failing to offer the appropriate rites to his ancestors' spirits. At a location known as Muye, or Shepherd's Wilderness, south of the last Shang capital, near present-day Anyang in Henan province, King Wu organized a sizable coalition of other disgruntled peoples and soundly defeated the Shang. The current People's Republic of China government has funded a special chronology project to pinpoint the precise events at the beginning of Chinese history because it views this as a significant national heritage. The Zhou conquest is currently dated to approximately 1045 BCE. This is one of the most significant dates in Chinese history. According to the story, the final Shang king withdrew into Deer Terrace Pavilion and burned himself to death following the epic battle and the Shang defeat. King Wu of the Zhou declared his intention to move to the Middle Kingdom and told heaven about his victory 8 days later. The term Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo, as previously mentioned, has emerged as the closest Chinese language equivalent of the English word China. The earliest known surviving example of this crucial term was found by researchers in 1963 on a bronze ritual vessel cast by the Zhou to commemorate their victory over the Shang. Despite their differences, the Zhou and Shang were both Chinese. More specifically, both contributed to a Chinese identity that was still developing. Particularly in contrast to the obviously foreign semi-nomadic cultures to the north, a conscious sense of identity as Huaxia, Chinese, appears to have developed over the 8 centuries of the Zhou dynasty. Nonetheless, during the Zhou dynasty, a large portion of the population in what is now known as China, including almost the whole south, remained outside this Huaxia world. At the same time, until surprisingly recently, some people in Vietnam and Korea also claimed to be descended from the same great civilization and legendary ancestors as these Chinese. 3. This early Chinese Huaxia identity was obviously open, inclusive, and defined in terms of civilization, as well as myths of common descent. As one Chinese text from the 9th century explained, when Confucius composed the Spring and Autumn Annals, he treated the various lords who used foreign rituals as foreign and those who approached the Chinese as Chinese. It wasn't precisely a national identity in the modern sense. King Wu of Zhou died just 2 years after defeating Shang, leaving his eldest son to take the throne in his place. The late king's brother, the Duke of Zhou, took over as regent on behalf of the new boy king because the new king was still very young and the Zhou dynasty was still a little unstable. However, 3 of the duke's brothers soon rebelled as other members of the royal family began to question the duke's intentions. This rebellion was put down by the Duke of Zhou in renewed military campaigns, which resulted in the death of one older brother and the exile of another. A particularly cherished tale about heaven sending down a great wind that flattened the crops is preserved in the Book of Documents, one of the 5 fundamental Confucian classics. The young king was motivated to open a specific metal-bound box that the Duke of Zhou had sealed to find a ceremonial response to this catastrophe. The king found in this box the documentation of a previous ceremony in which the Duke of Zhou had prayed for his own life in place of King Wu, who was ill but not yet dead. Unexpectedly dramatic evidence of the Duke of Zhou's selfless sincerity was found in this undisclosed document. According to the story, the Duke of Zhou willingly gave up his regentship after successfully establishing a more stable foundation for the dynasty. The Duke of Zhou had, at least in the conventional narrative, acted swiftly and decisively on behalf of the dynasty without considering his own interests. The Chinese political tradition was founded on these tales of the Duke of Zhou. They established the fundamental Confucian principle of rule by virtue, along with the crucial implication that a dynasty's legitimacy and, consequently, its right to rule could be undermined if its administration lacked virtue. In particular, the Duke of Zhou is closely linked to the development of the Mandate of Heaven, Qianming, a crucial Chinese political idea. The Zhou kings claim to be sons of heaven, Tianzi, with a mandate from heaven to rule all under heaven, Tianxia. Heaven was the supreme Zhou deity, replacing the previous Shangdi. Early pre-dynastic Zhou may have been influenced by northern culture, as evidenced by their veneration of heaven as a source of royal legitimacy, which is remarkably similar to inner Asian steppe beliefs in a universal sky god. 4. However, there was a distinct twist from the start to what became the typical Chinese approach to the widely accepted notion of the divine right of kings. The Duke of Zhou offered a more radical interpretation of the Mandate of Heaven, stating that it was revocable, whereas some members of the Zhou royal family might have preferred to see it as a permanent hereditary right. The continuation of efficient governance was essential to the survival of the dynasty. The same heaven upholds universal values and casts a shadow over everyone. Heaven's mandate had once been enjoyed by the Shang, who were allegedly also the Xia before them. However, the mandate was given to the Zhou because of the corruption of the Shang kings. Only when they deserved it would Zhou kings hold on to the mandate. The Book of Documents states that heaven sees as my people see, implying that the loss of the mandate of heaven may be indicated by public dissatisfaction. By the 4th century BCE, the renowned Confucian scholar Mencius, Mengzi, circa 385 Faisira, 312 BCE, dared to state unequivocally that toppling an evil ruler was not a crime, but rather as legitimate as punishing any common robber or thief. As a result, the Mandate of Heaven idea imposed an ideal standard obligation of meritorious rule on each dynasty and justified their frequent changes throughout pre-modern Chinese history. However, the idea that there could only be one valid dynasty under heaven at any given time may have been supported by the idea that heaven's mandate could only be held by a single son of heaven. 5. The idea of the Mandate of Heaven is still somewhat relevant today. The Chinese term for our contemporary Westernward revolution is change of mandate, which refers to gaming. In China in the 20th century, this term was frequently used. The duration of the Zhou dynasty was roughly 8 centuries. Though their claim to sole legitimate sovereignty under heaven, and their ability to bring the previously loose Shang network of regional affiliations into a more structured framework may have contributed to the establishment of a long-lasting ideal of political unity in China. Likely, the Zhou never enjoyed direct, centralized administration over a sizable territory. The emergence of regional territorial states gradually eclipsed the actual power of the Zhou kings, particularly after foreign forces destroyed the early Zhou capital in the west in 771 BCE and moved it to Luoyang in the east, starting the so-called Eastern Zhou period, 770–256 BCE. Eventually, during the Warring States period, 479–221 BCE, these states joined their sovereign kings to become independent nations, Guo, the 100 Thought Schools. The Zhou dynasty is regarded as the early period of Chinese civilization. During the Zhou, almost all of the major schools of indigenous thought and classic Chinese literature developed. This allusion to schools of thought is a little deceptive, though, as open eclecticism, the readiness to accept and integrate any ideas that may seem beneficial or good, has always been a defining characteristic of Chinese thought. There aren't many pre-modern Chinese who neatly and exclusively belong to one school of thought. However, even though it is somewhat artificial, we can effectively distinguish some broad lines of intellectual tradition. The most prominent are legalism, Taoism, sometimes spelled Taoism, and Confucianism. We may also point to the tradition of military specialists as an illustration of the breadth of Zhou-era thought, which was not restricted to these three major schools. Most people agree that Confucianism is the dominant tradition in East Asia and China. Nonetheless, the claim that Confucianism originated in the West is tenable. The closest Chinese language equivalent, Ru, specifically refers to scholars who study the ancient classics, with Confucianism being defined as the teachings of the Ru, Rujiao. In actuality, there isn't a single Chinese word or concept that exactly matches our English word, Confucian. The pre-modern Chinese cultural tradition was based primarily on classical texts. The classics did not take on their final form until relatively late, and it was not until the late 2nd century BCE that they achieved venerated canonical status, even though they contain what may be the oldest books in the Chinese literary tradition, excluding the slightly older inscriptions on oracle bones as books. 5 fundamental Confucian classics are as follows. 1. The Book of Documents, Shangshu, Shujing, or the Book of History. Great historical figures, from the fabled sage kings to the early Zhou, are credited with these speeches, announcements, and other records. Although the authenticity of the pre-Zhou texts could be more convincing, a large portion of the Zhou material is likely to be authentic. 2. About 300 early Zhou songs or poems are collected in the Book of Odes, Shijing, some of which are still highly valuable works of literature. 3. Yijing, sometimes spelled I Ching, is the Book of Changes. This divination guide uses milfoil stalk casting to access a set of 64 hexagrams, which are combinations of 6 broken and unbroken lines. 4. The 3 books in The Rites, Elai, cover a variety of subjects. Although some of these ritual texts are considered to be very old, they were compiled quite recently. 5. The Annals of Spring and Autumn, Chunkyu. This is the brief history of Confucius's native state of Lu, which spans 722–481 BCE. Because it is traditionally believed that Confucius wrote this history, scholars have closely examined its entries for what is likely deep moral lessons expressed through nuanced linguistic distinctions. Ultimately, we added 13 core classics to this list of 5, due to their assumed antiquity as depictions of an idealized golden age in the early Zhou and even earlier sage kings. The classics were considered important. These texts remained at the center of formal education in China and, to a large extent, all of East Asia, from the time they were first recognized as canonical in the late 2nd century BCE until the early 20th century. C.E. Confucius stressed the importance of study and critical thinking, even though studying the classics frequently involved tiresomely dry memorization and in-depth chapter-by-chapter textual commentary. Confucius once said, "To think without learning is dangerous. To learn without thinking is unavailing." Along with literacy, the Confucian classics made their way to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where they gradually grew in importance. Confucianism did not reach its peak in Japan until the early modern Tokugawa era, 1603–1868 CE. Confucianism flourished in Vietnam, especially after the 15th century, and reached its zenith in the early 19th century under the last dynasty, Nguyen, 1802–1945. Confucian influence peaked in Korea during the final pre-modern dynasty, the Chosun, 1392–1910. One Korean official proudly told a Japanese guest that the Korean ceremonial code was based on the precedents of the Zhou as late as the middle of the 19th century. This common Confucianism, which coexisted with a common usage of the Chinese writing system and classical written language, can even be used to define East Asia to a considerable degree. Because of this shared literary language, educated pre-modern Japanese, Vietnamese, and Koreans could read the Confucian classics in their original language instead of translation. It's crucial to remember that Confucianism's popularity in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam was not exclusively attributable to its Chinese roots. For instance, many Koreans eventually came to view themselves as even better Confucians than the Chinese, despite the popularity of a strong and seemingly successful Chinese imperial model, which surely played a significant early role in promoting imitation. The classics were generally seen as no more distinctively Chinese than the Bible's Old Testament, which is distinctively Jewish, the Quran, which is distinctively Arab, and the Buddhist texts, which are distinctively Indian. Instead, the ostensibly universal truth was invoked. Except for the spring and autumn annals, some sections of the ritual texts and the appendices, or wings, of the Book of Changes, Confucius himself only ascribed these Confucian classics on occasion. Although Confucius was traditionally credited with having some influence over the editing or transmission of each, the majority were thought to be significantly older than Confucius. Confucianism is named after the man we call Confucius, 551–479 BCE. Even though the study of the classics, the unique activity of the Ru, was essential to the actual application of Confucianism in pre-modern East Asia. Kongfuzi, or simply Kongzi, is the Chinese title, meaning Master Kong. His full name was Kong Xiu, and he was born in the northeastern state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province. Confucius is this title's Latinized, i.e., European, form. Confucius was a relatively unknown teacher during his own lifetime. Most of our trustworthy knowledge about the man and his beliefs comes from a compilation of his conversations, known as the Analects, Lun Yu in Chinese, which was put together by his followers after his passing. The main takeaway from Confucius was to lead by moral example. He felt people would naturally correct themselves if they led with appropriate ritual, li, and moral force, de. He thought any attempt to govern through rules and penalties would only encourage people to devise creative ways to get around the law. For instance, Confucius once stated unequivocally that the death penalty was wrong, asking, "Sir, why use killing in conducting your government? A noble person's virtue is like the wind, while a small person's is like grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it bends." A gentleman, Yunzi, who cultivates moral principles, hoping to influence others and eventually bring world peace, is the key to a beneficial society. Confucius once charmingly explained how this process of self-cultivation and internalization of virtue had worked in his life. At 15, my heart was set upon learning. At 30, I had become established. At 40, I was no longer perplexed. I could pursue my passions without going overboard at 70. Important specific virtues that a Confucian gentleman should develop include filial piety, xiao, humaneness or humanity, ren, and proper ritual observance, li. Bronze ritual vessels were cast as offerings to the spirits in the early days of Chinese civilization, leaving a legacy of ritual. However, the religious underpinnings of this age-old ritual were no longer important to Confucius. Ritual had evolved into a tool for self-discipline and a standard of appropriate behavior. According to Confucius, one becomes humane by mastering oneself and going back to ritual. The ability to empathize with others is the primary definition of humanity. In terms of humanity, you want to succeed first, then assist others in succeeding. You want to grow before assisting others in growing as well. One step toward being human is being able to identify with others, or, in the words of Confucius, do not do to others what you do not want for yourself. Respecting parents and ancestors appropriately is referred to as filial piety. Although filial piety is the most difficult Confucian value for contemporary Western individualists to empathize with, Confucians historically saw it as the cornerstone of a constructive society. Those who are inclined to offend against their superiors are few indeed among those who are filial to their parents and fraternal to their brothers, according to a passage in the Analects. Isn't the cornerstone of humanity being filial and fraternal? The following decree was issued by an empress in Japan in 757 CE. The ancients employed the filial piety principle to control the populace and maintain national harmony. This must be our top priority and the cornerstone of everything we do. Every family in the Japanese Empire should be required to own and assiduously memorize a copy of the classic of filial piety. One of the later additions to the Confucian canon was the classic of filial piety, Xiao Jing. It is unthinkable that all or even a large number of Japanese read this book in the 8th century. According to one reasonable estimate, at most 20,000 Japanese people interacted with written materials in Chinese at that time. 10. Nevertheless, the importance of filial piety to that interpretation of Confucianism and the imperial Confucian pose in Japan remains noteworthy. One of the main contradictions in Confucian thought is highlighted by the expectation of hierarchy ingrained in this ideal of serving parents filially and not upsetting superiors. On the one hand, Confucians conservatively aimed to preserve the memory of a highly aristocratic ancient Zhou social order. One of the more well-known quotes from Confucius is, "I transmit, but do not create." Furthermore, some of the most significant Confucian virtues, like filial piety and loyalty, zhong, can only be expressed in hierarchical relationships. This represents one aspect of the Confucian concept. Confucian philosophy, on the other hand, was blatantly egalitarian and meritocratic. Anyone can cultivate themselves to perfection and set an example for the rest of the world. The remarkable Chinese civil service examination system, which chose government officials based on anonymously graded performances on written tests, was the empire's ultimate realization of the meritocratic line in Confucian thinking. By the 3rd century BCE, China had already abandoned its truly hereditary aristocracy, as stated by Confucius. In education, there should be no class distinctions. This contradiction in Confucianism is partially resolved by the understanding that merit is inherently unequal. Although everyone can become their best selves, naturally gain seniority over time, only a select few can. Furthermore, its inherent contradictions and variant tendencies facilitated Confucianism's adaptability in interpretation and application. For example, the same Confucian principles justified a strict hereditary social hierarchy in early modern Japan under the pretext of taigi meibun, or the moral duty to perform the duties appropriate to one's title. Mencius, a second well-known Confucian teacher, who was already mentioned in our discussion of the mandate of heaven, emerged approximately a century after Confucius's time. Mencius most famously claimed that people are good by nature, like water, which flows in any direction but naturally gravitates downward. Mencius explained the indisputable reality of human misbehavior in practice with a fantastic story. Ox Mountain's trees used to be lovely. However, because it was on the edge of a big state, axes were used to cut down the trees. The trees still produce new buds and shoots despite this, drawing sheep and cattle for grazing. This explains why the mountain looks so bare. People frequently believe the mountain was never forested when they see this bareness. Humanity, in contrast to Ox Mountain's aridity, does not naturally exist in this state. But everyday activities frequently fetter and destroy people's inherent goodness, leading some to conclude that people never had the capacity for goodness. This story demonstrates a noteworthy early awareness of environmental degradation caused by human economic activity, in addition to persuasively stating a rhetorical point. Shunzi, c. 310 c. 219 BCE, was the third and last significant Confucian thinker of the classical era. Shunzi, who lived during the conclusion of the Warring States period, had a more pessimistic view of human nature than Mencius, which makes sense. According to Shunzi, innate human desires are malevolent urges that must be subdued via deliberate effort and training. Additionally, Zunzi's understanding of the regular order of nature was notably non-religious and rationalistic. Heaven's operations never stop. If you respond to them with order, you will experience good fortune. If you respond with chaos and misfortune, you will experience bad luck. Heaven cannot make you impoverished if you uphold the fundamentals and practice thrift. To put it another way, heaven benefits those who help themselves. In contrast to the Analects of Confucius and Mencius, the Sunzi book was never recognized as one of the 13 Confucian classics, even though it was an excellent collection of well-written essays. Taoism was the second most influential school of classical Chinese thought after Confucianism. Outside of China, Taoism had a far smaller impact on East Asian regions than Confucianism, but it was not unknown in Korea, and it may have even helped to establish the ideology of the Japanese Empire, giving the supposedly native Japanese religion, Shinto, the Tao of the spirits, its name. Even by the typically eclectic Chinese standards, Taoism is remarkably elusive and elusive. East Asia frequently uses the term Tao in non-Taoist contexts, such as the Japanese martial art known as Kendo, or the Wei Tao of the sword, and Chinese Daoxue, or the study of the Wei, Tao, which is known in English as Neo-Confucianism. The word Tao itself means path or road. In a philosophical sense, it came to mean the way. Even the concepts actively labeled as Taoist can show surprising diversity and ambiguity. For instance, the well-known yin-yang dualism is often labeled as Taoist and even imagined as central to Taoism. But it would be more helpful to view it simply as an independent strand of traditional Chinese thought. In addition, a distinct Taoist religion eventually emerged in the 2nd century CE, developing into a fairly distinct and well-defined religious tradition, complete with its own canonical body of scripture, liturgy, priests, and institutions. Even this institutionalized Taoist religion was internally complex. The Daozang, the set of Taoist religious scriptures, consists of over 1,000 separate texts. For the classical Zhou era, however, Taoist thought may be defined as two relatively short and non-religious books, Laozi, Lao Tzu, and Zhuangzi, Chuang Tzu. Nevertheless, Laozi means Old Master, and the author's identity and the date of composition are uncertain, possibly as late as the 3rd century BCE. The language of the Laozi is simple, poetic, and extremely enigmatic. One tradition claims that the man from whom the book got its title was an older contemporary of Confucius who worked as an archivist at the Zhou capital and once allegedly even taught Confucius himself. Historians, on the other hand, think that Zhuangzi, Master Zhuangzhou, circa 369–286 BCE, was a real historical figure, and the book that bears his name is a delightful, if sometimes linguistically and conceptually challenging, collection of parables and tall tales. One of Zhuangzi's best examples is his story about Cook Ding, a master butcher who, after years of practice, learned to follow the natural patterns of joints, tendons, and ligaments so that they would flop. The whole thing comes apart like a clod of earth crumbling. After years of practice, Zhuangzi no longer saw the entire carcass. Instead, he wielded his blade with his spirit. A good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A mediocre cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. I've owned this knife for 19 years and have used it to cut thousands of oxen, yet the blade remains as sharp as if it had just been sharpened. Such a cook truly understood the art of cooking. The most significant central idea in Taoism is undoubtedly the way or Tao, but this Tao cannot be described in words. As the well-known opening line of Laozi states, the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. Despite this, the Tao is unavoidable, influencing and forming everything. The Taoist Tao transcended trivial manufactured human concerns in contrast to the Confucian Tao, which was particularly moral and human-centered. According to Laozi, heaven and earth are not humane, viewing all things as straw dogs, expendable sacrificial tokens. Humans and their problems are insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Naturally, Taoists were among the first people in the world to cultivate a sophisticated sense of the beauty found in wild places. Not only was human morality fabricated, but it might even work against us. Stealing happens because people value rare, precious goods like gold and jade, and competition arises because society rewards the deserving. Ugliness emerges when everyone on the planet recognizes beauty as beauty. Laozi warns, when everyone knows something is good, nothing comes. Therefore, wisdom is avoiding such goods. The wise person doesn't hoard. He gains more for himself the more he uses for others, and he receives more in return the more he gives to others. The goal of the way of heaven is to do good rather than harm. To do things without fighting is the way of the sage. Non-action, Wu Wei, is often the best course of action. The Taoists were early proponents of laissez-faire policies. Although the Chinese imperial government was highly inconsistent, both Taoist and Confucian theories tended to consciously advocate an ideally minimalist approach to rulership. In fact, some early French economists, known as the physiocrats, may have coined the French phrase laissez-faire in the 18th century, appreciating what they saw as the minimum of government intervention in the Chinese economy. Confucians typically advocated for tax cuts and giving rest to the populace, and they valued moral leadership over rules and penalties. On the other hand, Taoists thought that taking active measures would only worsen matters. If lords and kings follow Laozi's advice, Doing nothing leaves nothing undone. The way remains constant. Everything will change. Legalism, Fajia, the third great school of classical Chinese thought, opposes the Taoist and Confucian ideal of minimal government. Legalism, as its name suggests, strongly emphasizes government practices grounded in codified, rigorously enforced written law. Compared to Confucianism, legalism was even less of a recognized academic philosophical school. Legalism evolved less from teaching and theory than from certain tendencies in administrative practice that emerged throughout the Warring States period, despite the existence of some significant legalist texts, most notably the Book of Lord Shang, Shang Junshu, attributed to Shang Yang, Dmer 338 BCE, and most importantly, the Han Feizi, Master Han Fei, written by a student of the Confucian Shunzi named Han Fei, d. 233 BCE. Some believe the legalists provided realism as an alternative to Confucian idealism and morality. True sage kings are uncommon, even though their moral example may or may not inspire some individuals to make the necessary corrections, as the Confucians hoped. All people, however, are inherently motivated by self-interest, and we can change this behavior by creating explicit laws supported by strong incentives such as set rewards and penalties. According to the Book of Lord Shang, a state can be effectively administered by having clear laws governing its officials. Men are only sometimes intelligent and considerate. By encouraging unity among the populace, the ruler keeps them from hatching schemes for their own benefit. The state's power will then be consolidated, and a state with consolidated power is strong, but a nation that enjoys talking is divided. The Qin Kingdom, where Lord Shang was prime minister in the 4th century BCE, became the most powerful of the warring states thanks to its unwavering dedication to the state's objectives of creating a rich country and a strong army, as the slogan put it. Eventually, this dedication allowed the Qin Kingdom to unite all the other kingdoms into the First Chinese Empire. In the 20th century, modern China also revived the memory of ancient legalism, seeing it as a progressive movement that, more than 2,000 years ago, had already argued against blindly adhering to conservative traditions and insisted on adapting to the changing times. In the late 19th century, modern Japan deliberately invoked the ancient Chinese legalist slogan, "Rich country, strong army," as the formal ideological foundation of industrial and technological development. As the ancient legalists noted, people used to live in caves, but it would be foolish to do so now merely because it was the traditional way. China began drafting legal codes as early as the 9th century BCE, and the foundational classic of law, Fajing, was written in the late 5th century BCE. Legalism served as the ideological cornerstone of the First Chinese Empire, and even though explicit legalism was discredited for being harsh and inflexible, the Chinese Empire nevertheless centered a large portion of its identity on the idea of government by law. In the 8th century CE, when a new Japanese imperial government was consciously establishing itself on what was thought to be the continental Chinese model, this was so true that the Japanese considered codes of law to be the very foundation of that model. This era is commonly referred to by Japanese historians as the Age of Penal and Administrative Law, Ritsuryo Jidai. However, more indigenous developments would soon replace Chinese-style legal codes in Japan. Throughout the ages, the more humanistic Confucianism has won out, even though pre-modern China never completely abandoned the government by law. The art of war. There were numerous schools of thought in late Zhou China, but the three main ones were legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism. One significant early group was the adherents of Mozi, c. 5th century BCE, who promoted universal love and taught a group of followers defensive warfare tactics to help shield small nations from outside aggression. The book Mozi covers military defense topics in no fewer than 9 chapters. These topics include siege warfare, tactics, and scaling ladders. It should come as no surprise that the Warring States era produced several military experts. Sunzi's Art of War, Sunzi Bingfa, was the first military text and is regarded as the oldest military treatise in the world. This book is still studied in military academies around the world, and it has inspired some contemporary politicians and business people. The 7 military classics, Wujing Qishu, is a collection of 6 military treatises from the Zhou dynasty and 1 later work combined during China's late imperial period. Like many other early Chinese texts, Sunzi's authorship and date are hotly contested. The supposed author, Master Sun, also called Sunzi, is thought to have lived between the late 4th and 6th centuries BCE. In general, only specialized scholars are interested in the date of composition of these early texts. However, given the rapidly evolving nature of warfare in the late Zhou period, it may have a significant impact on Sunzi. Early Zhou warfare had been centered on chariot-riding aristocrats who upheld the ideals of chivalric ritual. Armies were usually small and campaigns were brief. In the past, fighting honorably was valued more highly than winning. However, big nations grew more prepared for total war as China entered the Warring States era. Once a privilege and monopoly of the aristocracy, the right to bear arms was now a universal male obligation. Massive new armies of peasant foot soldiers, up to hundreds of thousands of men, equipped with lethal crossbows and occasionally mobilized for protracted conflicts, were made possible by military conscription, a draft army based on mandatory household registration lists. Furthermore, there were at least 590 distinct wars during the 2.5 centuries of the Warring States period, or more than 2 wars per year on average. The familiarity of war had grown grim. Greater ruthlessness was one effect of the evolving nature of war. Now, it was all about winning, not about fighting with honor. Sunzi is renowned for calling the military a way, Tao, of deception, a statement that seems to reflect the brutality of the Warring States in modern times. It is crucial to be surprised. Attack where he is unprepared. At the same time, conceal your dispositions to give the impression that your forces lack structure and pattern. Emerge where he does not expect. The overwhelming force is used at the attack point. Glory and heroism are not the goal. Victory is. The best way to defeat a bloody one easily and decisively is to ensure preconditions are met before the first blow. As a result, the winning military first proclaims victory before fighting. Intelligence is essential. She was a keyword for Sunzi. Sunzi interpreted she as, more specifically, the latent disposition of potential force, like a crossbow cocked and ready to fire with a slight pull on the trigger or an avalanche ready to fall. Sunzi clarified, "Thus, the shy of someone skilled at setting people to battle is like rolling round rocks from a mountain." The goal is to use intelligence rather than force to win with the least conflict and devastation. Sunzi says there won't be any danger in 100 battles if you know yourself and your enemy. This focus on intelligence, if not always on preventing violence, was also consistent with the new Warring States strategy. Massive and advanced logistical support was needed for the massive new peasant conscript armies, including the production of armor and weapons on a large scale, as well as supplies of clothing and food. The military treatises of the time generally stressed the value of planning and discipline, and training and organization became crucial. The commander was now a great strategist working behind the lines rather than a warrior who valiantly led the charge into battle or an aristocrat who rode a chariot. Sunzi is renowned for attacking the enemy's plans before attacking his cities. Physical combat was subordinated to cerebral warfare. Sun Tzu proposed the intriguing notion of winning a war without engaging in combat. Some claim that this is a distinctively Chinese strategy for fighting wars, while others characterize Chinese culture as non-militaristic. Even in military affairs, people generally valued intelligence over force, and a military career was not nearly as valuable as a literary one under the later empire. The familiar Western and Japanese traditions and the Chinese Confucian ethos always prioritize the literary and civilian, Wen, over the martial, Puyu. Confucianism was never the only school of thought in China, but the Analects state that when asked about tactics, Confucius replied, "I have heard about sacrificial vessels, but have learned nothing about the deployment of troops." The next day, he made his departure. There have undoubtedly been many wars throughout China's lengthy history, and one contemporary scholar who has closely examined the 7 military classics and their application in late imperial warfare comes to the conclusion that the core tenet of Chinese strategic culture was not all that dissimilar from the Western realist maxim, "If you want peace, prepare for war." Specifically, the first imperial unification of China was forged through a bloody war. First Empire. Qin's faults, 221–207 BCE. The Hellenistic era of massive autocratic empires replaced the numerous small city-states that characterized ancient Greece as a result of Alexander the Great's conquests, 356–323 BCE. About a century later, China experienced a similar process in Eastern Eurasia. The early Zhou realm in China comprised many small, semi-independent domains that had long since united into a few relatively large territorial kingdoms. These kingdoms came together as a single empire for the first time in 221 BCE. Ying Jing, 262–210 BCE, the man who would become the first emperor of China, was 39 years old by Chinese standards when he united what appeared to be the entire civilized world, a victory so complete that he boasted, "Wherever there are traces of people, there are none who are not my subjects." 16. Although the ancient phrase, "all under heaven," Tianxia, was used repeatedly and obviously exaggeratedly to refer to the realm, what we now consider to be China proper was now, for the first time, unified into a single nation. Despite its apparent naturalness, this unification was most likely not completely inevitable. Despite not attempting a single central government, the early Zhou had established an ideal of a universal son of heaven under heaven's universal moral order. One of several separate nations with significant regional diversity was the classical world of the ancient Chinese philosophers. Even a century after the initial unification, in 221 BCE, the empire still spoke several different languages derived from the languages of the former warring states. Paradoxically, Qin, the kingdom that overthrew all the others and established the original Chinese empire, had started out as a small semi-Chinese frontier state on the outskirts of the Chinese world. Within the passes, the original Zhou heartland, was the location of the Qin state's official establishment in 770 BCE. There is unmistakable proof of a blending of Zhou-style Chinese and non-Chinese influences in one of the first distinctly Qin-style archaeological artifacts, originally restricted to an area west of the region within the passes. Qin remained less developed than the other states on the Central Plain to its east until the warring states. However, Qin's position on the Zhou world's northwest frontier might have allowed it to trade with Central Asia. Its frontier location might have also fueled warlike tendencies, and Qin's comparatively lax adherence to traditional Confucian principles might have allowed it to experiment more freely with the radical new ideas of legalism. As a result, Qin might have been a pioneer of the advantages of backwardness. Free from the weight of all their customs, Qin could selectively appropriate practical concepts from the more developed Eastern kingdoms. An important turning point in the history of both Qin and China was the arrival of Lord Shang from the East in 361 BCE. The Qin state's extraordinary level of receptivity to the talent of immigrants was one of its noteworthy characteristics. A century later, even the first emperor himself was the illegitimate son of an immigrant merchant who had become chancellor, according to a scurrilous, and most likely false, rumor. Following his arrival, Lord Shang was permitted to test out legalist reforms by the Qin government. Lord Shang established a centralized bureaucratic system of administration, unified the weights and measures systems, issued new law codes, and created new non-hereditary titles over the following 10 years. Although he started the Qin war machine, Lord Shang was executed in 338 BCE after a dispute with the royal family. The man who would go on to become the first emperor of China took the throne as the final king of Qin in 247 BCE, a century later. After surviving multiple assassination attempts, this king became more and more afraid to go out in public or even to reveal his whereabouts. When his armies overran the last warring states, Qi, in 221 BCE, his first documented action after this historic victory was to confer with his officials to develop a more dignified title for himself than simply king. Their discussions led to the creation of the new title Huangdi, or emperor. This man is most commonly known in history as Qin Shi Huangdi, which translates to First Emperor of Qin. East Asian rulers never use their own names once they have ascended the throne. Instead, they use a variety of euphemisms while they are still alive and different posthumous titles after they pass away. Until 1912, China used Huangdi, which influenced similar imperial terms in Vietnam and Japan. In contrast, pre-modern Korea continued to use the more casual and traditional title king. To foster a single imperial culture, the first emperor of Qin famously standardized all the vanquished kingdoms' weights and measures, coins, legal codes, and writing systems. He created 44 new administrative units north of the Ordos Desert, moved hundreds of thousands of people from the interior to the northern frontier, and built fortifications across the northern borders, widely regarded as the first iteration of the Great Wall of China. Much of southeast China was first introduced into the Chinese world as part of the first emperor's southern conquests, reaching northern Vietnam. According to one estimate, the first emperor helped dismantle long-standing local identities and forge new allegiances across the empire by relocating at least 3.17 million people to the northern and southern frontiers. Skeptical modern scholars have occasionally been tempted to question whether any pre-modern government could have ever truly exercised that degree of effective control over such a large area, as traditional Chinese histories depict the Qin regime as being extremely systematic and intrusive. However, in 1975, archaeologists found about 1,000 wood strips, which were China's main writing material before the development of paper. Documents from the Qin era can be found in the Yunmeng region of central China. These findings support the conventional view of legalist bureaucratic machinery as comparatively effective. At the same time, the Qin's reputation for draconian punishments is neither strongly supported nor contradicted by these new findings. According to revisionists, the Qin government may not have been as oppressive as later Chinese Confucians have historically recalled. Archaeologically rediscovered Qin texts also reveal more diversity of thought and evidence of a less submissive subject population than previously thought. Following a protracted period of ceaseless conflict, the first emperor defended his conquests by claiming that they would bring about peace and equitable justice for all. Thomas Hobbes's well-known theory that it might be necessary for people to submit to the authority of a powerful state in the sole interest of self-preservation was already foreshadowed by a book written at the Qin court around 239 BCE, 2,000 years before Hobbes was born. There is no greater disorder than the absence of a son of heaven. Without a son of heaven, the powerful oppress the weak, the many mistreat the few, and troop deployments cannot stop the destruction of one another. Warfare torments the whole world without cease, because there are lords and princes, said the first emperor. The first emperor appointed 70 scholars to serve as advisors to the throne to uphold traditional values. Dissension persisted, especially criticism of the Qin regime, which was negatively compared to the romanticized memory of antiquity. The first emperor famously ordered the destruction of all books in 213 BCE, except a few helpful technical treatises and histories of the Qin state. He is said to have ordered the execution of 460 scholars for subversion in 212 BCE. These two heinous deeds became irrevocable symbols of Qin oppression in Confucian memory. Arcane methods of extending life also piqued the first emperor's interest, and it's possible he even saw himself as a god who could align the universe with cosmic power. 21. The massive tomb he had built for himself might be the best illustration of his self-aggrandizement. The 20-mile-round tomb contains a whole terracotta army of thousands of life-sized clay soldiers buried and only recently found by chance. Thus, although the first emperor's reputation may have been damaged by Confucian prejudices in later dynasties, the enormous scope of his ambition is still authentic. Traditional histories indicate that the severity and rigidity of Qin legalist regulations quickly sparked a revolt. The land was in revolt within a year of the first emperor's passing in 210 BCE. At the same time, the nation was being torn apart by a power struggle within the court. When Qin Shi Huangdi passed away, a certain eunuchs were castrated imperial household servants, allegedly plotted to conceal the emperor's passing for a short time and created a fake decree directing the emperor's capable eldest son to end his own life. As a result, a younger son, who was incompetent and soon turned into a puppet, inherited the throne. This second emperor, encouraged by the eunuch, started to suspect other members of his own family and had 10 of his sisters and 12 of his brothers put to death. The second emperor committed suicide after 3 years because his status had deteriorated to such a pitiful level. Rebels had already arrived at the gates by this point. After just 15 years as an imperial dynasty, the Qin fell in 207 BCE. Qin had succeeded in rolling up the empire like a mat, enveloping the entire universe, pocketing all within the 4 seas, and swallowing up everything in all 8 directions. But some rustic rebels suddenly brought Qin to his knees, according to Jia Yi, 201-169 BCE, born just 9 years after the first emperor's death, and wrote a classic essay titled The Faults of Qin. Why? The basic distinction between retaining power and assuming authority is the source of the ruler's lack of humanity and morality. These mistakes were made worse by the Qin's repression of dissent, which stopped wise men from expressing their genuine allegiance by forewarning the dangers about to arise. Jia Yi was a shrewd critic of the Qin dynasty, but he blamed the dynasty's downfall on its excesses and abuses and the incapacity of the first emperor's successors, not the imperial system itself. On the ruins of the Qin, a new imperial dynasty was established after a comparatively short civil war. The Qin failure did not undermine the imperial system, but it did undermine explicit legalism. Until 1912, the Qin institutional model, along with the imperial title Huangdi, continued to exist more moderately for 2 millennia. The Qin concept of China as a single, cohesive nation is still in use today, and it is fitting that the name Qin is probably where our English word China originates, from Sanskrit. Although it lasted only 15 years, the Qin dynasty brought the warring states together. At the time of Qin's collapse, many people still remembered the old independent kingdoms, so it was reasonable to hope for a return to the previous warring states' multinational order. The unified imperial model quickly returned, even though some of those kingdoms made a brief comeback as participants in the anti-Qin uprising. Liu Bang, who died in 195 BCE, was ultimately the most significant rebel leader. Liu came from a lowly background. He started as a local police chief after passing an exam. However, by 207 BCE, a rebel army led by Liu had infiltrated the area within the passes and taken the Qin capital, ending the Qin dynasty. Liu Bang sealed up the Qin treasuries and waited for the supreme rebel coalition commander to arrive, despite the rebel leader's earlier agreement that whoever captured the area within the passes first would become its next king. Rather than being granted the strategically and historically important area within the passes, Liu Bang was made king of Han, situated in the Han River Valley area a little further south. This assignment had the long-term effect of making Han the name of the imperial dynasty. Liu Bang was eventually adopted as the standard name for all ethnic Chinese people due to its founding. The Han people are Chinese today. Liu Bang used the treacherous assassination of Chu's king by another commander in 206 BCE as an excuse to resume the civil war. This bronze carriage model dates from the late Han dynasty, specifically the Eastern Han dynasty, 2nd century CE. Excavated in 1969 at Wuwei, Gansu, Liu Bang's first move was to strike north and retake the region within the passes. This gave Liu Bang the same base area from which the Zhou and the Qin had previously conquered China. After several more years of seesaw conflict, by 202 BCE, Liu Bang had defeated all his rivals and established himself as the founding emperor of a new dynasty, the Han. However, years of civil war had reportedly devastated the land, so the new emperor could not even assemble a team of 4 horses in matching colors for his carriage. Such feudalization may have been necessary at first, but later, Han emperors swiftly reversed the policy, and within roughly half a century the empire effectively eliminated semi-independent principalities and restored Qin-style centralized administration. Liu Bang's posthumous temple, Han Gaozu, gained historical recognition as the high ancestor of the Han. Emperor Gaozu rewarded his leading lieutenants and relatives with appointments as kings or princes over what were initially semi-autonomous principalities. The Qin dynasty had done much the same thing a decade or two earlier, but Han Gaozu, the former Liu Bang, was rudely surprised by organized opposition when he led a massive military force, reportedly consisting of 320,000 foot soldiers, against the nomadic tribes to the north, after he had taken control of the Central Plain. The nomadic tribes north of China had united into their first imperial confederation, the Xiongnu. The Great Wall may have been built more as a projection onto the nomads than to keep them out, but the transition from Chinese-style farming to ranching and finally to true steppe pastoral nomadism happens unevenly along China's northern frontier. In fact, the Qin walls brought some of the best Xiongnu archaeological sites inside the Qin Empire. Although we call the region Mongolia today, the term Mongol was not coined in Qin or Han times. Chinese sources typically distinguish between areas north and south of the Gobi Desert, roughly corresponding to modern Outer and Inner Mongolia. The first nomadic imperial confederation to the north of China may have been sparked by a new type of political organization that could mobilize the military potential of the dispersed steppe tribes. The Xiongnu were not a homogeneous group. Rather, they were a confederation of tribes, including various ethnic and linguistic groups. If there was one, the Xiongnu language is still unknown. This should be no surprise, as most steppe nomadic empires were formed by such mixtures. For instance, a Roman visitor to the camp of Attila the Hun, c. 406-453 CE, in Western Eurasia, reported that the Huns were a mixed group, speaking the Hunnic, Gothic, and Latin languages. Attila's name was Gothic. There has been a persistent theory that the Huns, who terrorized the Roman Empire, might have been a westward migrating splinter group of the same Xiongnu, who had previously faced Han Dynasty China. However, since the Xiongnu and the Huns are known to have been internally mixed groupings, such speculation may ultimately be pointless. Like the Qin, before it, the early Han Dynasty had a conscript or draft army, which required all adult males to serve for 2 years, usually 1 year of training and 1 year of active duty. This allowed the Han Dynasty to muster an army that was truly enormous, but also one that was essentially made up of amateur peasant infantry. To their surprise, as they marched north, Han Gaozu's forces found themselves no match for Xiongnu mounted archers, who were used to living in the saddle as warriors. For a whole week in 200 BCE, a mountaintop near modern Datong, just east of the northernmost bend of the Yellow River, surrounded and imprisoned the first Han emperor, Gaozu. The Han dynasty, humbled by this initial experience with the nomadic military might of the Xiongnu, pursued policies of peace with the Xiongnu for the next 50 years, sending Han imperial daughters to marry Xiongnu chieftains and lavishly presenting them with gifts. This policy of appeasement ended only after Wudi, Emperor Wu, the martial emperor, became the 6th Han emperor in 141 BCE, and he ruled for 54 years, 141-87 BCE, the longest reign of any Chinese emperor before the 18th century, marked by great success and controversy. Wudi held formal court debates shortly after assuming the throne regarding the wisdom of the appeasement policy toward the Xiongnu, which was rejected because it did not stop the ongoing Xiongnu raids. In addition, the Han dynasty had developed the military resources necessary to successfully confront the Xiongnu. At the beginning of the dynasty, the Han army lacked cavalry. By the time Wudi assumed the throne, several horse breeding stations had been established, and the Han army now had access to approximately 300,000 horses. Infantry with crossbows fitted with precision triggers and fired from wagon trains had also proven effective against nomadic warriors. But the Han still faced significant logistical challenges in mounting sustained warfare on the vast open reaches of the steppe, where the nomads could always pull back their tents and wait until supplies ran out for the Chinese armies. As a result, Wudi devised a new grand strategy for outflanking the Xiongnu, which included the conquest and incorporation into the Han Empire of southern Manchuria and northern Korea to the northeast, and the establishment of more formal diplomatic and commercial exchanges with the western regions through the use of a Xiongnu defector as a guide. In the northwest, Emperor Wu started by sending an embassy to seek allies in the western regions, but only 2 out of 100 party members returned to China 13 years later. During the next few decades, Han military campaigns brought what is now Gansu and Xinjiang, eastern Turkestan, into the empire as part of the western extension of the Han imperial offensive against the Xiongnu. On one occasion, the Han armies even captured the Samarkand area in Uzbekistan, crossing the Pamir Mountains into Central Asia in 101 BCE. The Han established a chain of garrisons and fortifications in the northwest, which disrupted the oasis sources of tribute for the Xiongnu, and ultimately led to the Xiongnu Empire's disintegration by about 73 BCE. The financial cost of this strategy also almost bankrupted the Han dynasty. One recent estimate puts the total expense of Han Wudi's military operations in the northwest at 1.89 trillion Chinese cash over 40 years. Emperor Wu's aggressive military campaigns severely strained the Han economy, even though the expansion of the Han Empire to the northwest helped promote the Silk Roads, where camel caravans brought grapes from Persia and glass from the Mediterranean in exchange for Chinese silk. They prompted intrusive new state economic interventions, including taxes on merchant inventories, government monopolies on mines, and manufacturing and distributing iron, salt, alcohol, and coins. A fascinating record of a court debate in 81 BCE over the wisdom of continuing these economic policies survives, known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron. The Han Dynasty needed a new theoretical basis for legitimizing legalism after the fall of Qin, and although Wudi was not exactly a Confucian, he found his source of imperial justification in that school. Despite his aggressive military expansionism and economic interventionism, which may seem reminiscent of Qin dynasty legalism, Wudi was ironically the emperor who established Confucianism as imperial orthodoxy. The original Han founders had been rough military men, and in one famous story, a scholar presented copies of the classics to the first Han emperor, who patted his mount and claimed he had won his empire from horseback and had no need for books. The Confucian canon was first officially defined by Han Wudi in 136 BCE, when he assigned a master to teach each of the 5 classics. In 124 BCE, Wudi also established an imperial academy to study the classics. This academy initially had only a few students, but by the end of the Han Dynasty, there were reportedly 30,000 students in 1,850 rooms. The academy began to elaborate systems of testing and regional recommendations for students. The Han Dynasty encouraged local officials to recommend men known for their Confucian virtues for government office. Throughout the centuries of the Han Dynasty, there was a growing expectation for officials to be scholarly gentlemen. Ambitious families encouraged their children to study for the purpose of career advancement. Over time, the promotion of schools extended even to rural communities. During the late Han era, villagers who demonstrated conspicuous Confucian virtues had their doors marked with tablets, and the law began to enforce these expectations. For instance, in the last century BCE, the law exempted people from compulsory labor service during mourning for deceased parents or those whose parents were elderly. In 116 CE, high officials were required to observe 3 years of mourning following their fathers' deaths. In 175 CE, the Imperial Academy decreed the literal carving of correct texts from the 5 classics on a stone, marking the final consummation of Confucianism as Han Dynasty imperial orthodoxy. Han Dynasty. The careful study of the classics laid the groundwork for Confucianism, but some aspects of Confucian thought were unique to the Han Dynasty, which Dong Zhongshu, 179–104 BCE, best illustrates. According to Dong's interpretation of Confucianism, the ruler's special function is to harmonize relations between heaven, earth, and man. Humane behavior was thought to reverberate sympathetically throughout the natural order. So if only the monarch corrected his heart, even the seasons might follow in proper order. This resulted in the development of an ideology that legitimized the Han Empire by linking it to the cosmological structure of the universe, while at the same time limiting autocratic behavior by threatening harsh supernatural punishments. Therefore, Confucianism promoted autocratic imperial minimalism. For instance, the dynastic history of the former Han describes a high government official who rode past a brawl without intervening, but stopped to ask about an ox panting. The official justified his seemingly unusual actions by claiming that while subordinates should handle routine brawls, top officials tasked with harmonizing the yin and yang should handle an ox panting due to unseasonable heat. Although the Han dynasty's 400-year reigns were briefly interrupted by the usurpation of Wang Mang in 923 CE, its legacy is still so important that the Chinese are still referred to as Han people today. One growing issue was economic polarization. Private land ownership was well established by the late Warring States period, but the Warring States and early imperial governments were based on a tax and conscription base consisting of many roughly equal small farmers. Nevertheless, some wealthy families were able to acquire large estates during the Han Dynasty, which resulted in the loss of many smallholders who lost their property and frequently became tenants, servants, or even vagrants and bandits. This decreased the central government's tax base, placing an even greater burden on the few small farmers on the tax rolls. Court politics also caused other issues, especially the alleged excessive power of eunuchs and the families of imperial consorts. Starting in 166 CE, a series of purges punished dissident critics of eunuch power, resulting in the death of over 100 distinguished gentlemen in prison and the lifetime ban from office of another 600 or 700. Ironically, this gave the posture of lofty withdrawal and disengagement from the government a certain amount of fashionable moral cachet. A religious uprising broke out in 184 CE, leading to the Yellow Turban's overthrow. Independent military commanders took control, and in 191 one of these generals took the heir to the throne and destroyed the late Han capital, Luoyang, looting and burning the vast imperial libraries, among other things. 26. As warlord armies trampled across China, beside their horses they hang the heads of men, behind their horses they carry the captive, women. The female poet who penned these final lines was captured and lived with a Xiongnu prince for 12 years before being ransomed, and after her captivity, she reported the loss of her father's private library, which held 4,000 rolls of books. There were 13 major independent warlord regimes in the Han Empire's ruins by the year 196. Some of their armies, according to reports, needed extra strategies to survive each year, turning to plunder when they were hungry and throwing away what they had when they were satisfied. However, one warlord, Cao Cao, 155-220, whose father had been an adopted son of the Han Dynasty chief eunuch, gained control over the puppet Han Emperor and used this control over the emperor to seize control of all of North China. By 207, he may have controlled half of China's population. It wasn't until after Cao Cao's own death in 220 that Chao's son finally dared to formally overthrow the last Han monarch and declare himself the founding emperor of a new imperial dynasty called the Wei, or Cao Wei, to differentiate it from various other states called Wei. The situation soon stabilized somewhat as the various warlord enclaves resolved into 3 relatively large empires, commonly called the Three Kingdoms. See map 2.4. The Wei dynasty, 220-265, was ruled by Cao Cao's family in the north. The Wu, 232-280 Empire in the southeast, in the lower Yangtze River region, established its capital at what is now Nanjing, Nanking, and the Shu Han, 221-263 dynasty in the southwest, in the area of modern Sichuan. Shu Han is clearly a composite, with Shu being an old place name for the area, and Han referring to the Han dynasty, as the Shu Han emperors claimed special legitimacy through descent from the old Han imperial family. The Three Kingdoms period has been immortalized as the legendary age of Chinese military strategy and heroic warfare through Chinese fiction, video games, and more recently, the romance of the Three Kingdoms, Sanguo Jitong's Yan Yi. One of the most popular and widely read pre-modern Chinese novels was written much later. The earliest surviving edition dates from 1522. Still, it is a fictionalized retelling of the history of this period, with Cao Cao cast as the main villain. Stages and fiction have extolled the period's brilliant tactics, battles, and dramatic political rivalries, but it was also a time of notable literary and intellectual awakenings, individualism, and some remarkably colorful eccentrics. The ideological underpinnings of Han Confucianism were severely weakened by the fall of the Han dynasty. Rather than elegant discussions of lofty metaphysical principles known as mysterious learning, xuanshui, which frequently involved references to the Laozi, Zhuangzi, and the Book of Changes, seemingly dry classical chapter and verse scholarship became less popular. In Laozi fashion, people paradoxically answered profound questions like what existed before the universe began or what lies beyond the borders of heaven and earth with nothing. As a result, people started to contend that nothing was the source of everything. A trend emerged for retreating into libertinism, hedonism, wine, and drugs, often accompanied by the cynical observation that both the sage and the tyrant ultimately end up equally dead. A humorous character rode out in a wheelbarrow, carrying a jug of wine, and instructed a servant armed with a shovel to bury him wherever he passed away. However, for some of the most renowned individuals of this era, such as Ruan Ji, 2010-263, one of the renowned 7 sages of the bamboo grove, indulging in frequent drunkenness and philosophical ambiguity, primarily served as a means of evading perilous political intrigue. They deliberately broke the strict rules of Confucian decorum, ilai, to demonstrate their genuine morality. During the late Han dynasty, establishing a local reputation for Confucian virtue and receiving recommendations for office created a powerful incentive for hypocritical pretense. However, figures like Ruan Ji, who lived in the 3rd century, offered an appealing counter-reaction against this hypocrisy. In 265, one of its generals usurped the throne of the 3 kingdoms and established a new dynasty, the Western Jin, 265-316. In 280, the Western Jin succeeded in uniting the other 3 kingdoms with the final subjugation of Wu in the southeast. This reunification was short-lived, lasting little more than 10 years before it started to fall apart again. Learning from the ease with which he seized the throne through a palace coup, the first Western Jin emperor attempted to strengthen his family's position by appointing 27, or eventually 50, of his close relatives as princes, often with actual regional military power. However, this action sparked a fierce power struggle within the imperial family after the founding Western Jin emperor died in 290, and imperial power soon fell apart, upsetting the 8 princes. These warring princes typically relied on cavalry forces drawn from semi-nomadic tribal auxiliaries. Throughout the Han dynasty, the practice of military conscription had lapsed, leading to the replacement of the draft-based citizen army with more professional forces, many of whom were ethnic minorities. Nomadic allies who had settled within the borders of the Han Empire in a belt stretching from Manchuria in the east to the northern loop of the Yellow River in the west had also assumed much of the burden of northern frontier defense. As the Chinese imperial government imploded amid protracted and devastatingly self-destructive civil wars, non-Chinese warriors often found themselves in control of the battlefields. In 304, one Xiongnu chieftain proclaimed himself ruler of an independent state in North China. The Western Jin capital at Luoyang fell in 311, and the alternate Western Jin imperial capital at Chang'an, modern Xi'an, also fell in 316. As a contemporary lamented by this time, marauding nomads watered their horses in the Yangtze. Dramatic parallel events also took place far to the west. In 376, groups of Goths, escaping the Huns' ravages, crossed the Danube and delivered the first of several military shocks that ultimately brought down the Western Roman Empire. Similar traveling bands of barbarian warriors were present in China, but there were no actual invasions outside the country's borders, and Chinese imperial unity was shattered. Between the 3rd and 7th centuries, 37 historically recognized dynasties in China, 22 of which had clearly non-Chinese rulers. This was the greatest age of division in Chinese imperial history.